complete, but on our website there's tons of information at the zeitgeistmovement.com where anyone can see our videos and the PDFs and get a much more thorough understanding. What I find is that when you engage this information, the people can understand it, people in general can understand it, but it goes against a lot of value issues that people have in the way they relate to their environment. And that's usually the hurdle that you have when I describe this information. But by the end of this, there is the Q&A, as Jason pointed out, so please consider, if you have like a notebook or something, that's always great to write down any questions, because I have a feeling when I finish this presentation last night, they're going to have plenty of questions by the time I'm done, because it isn't necessarily an introduction. This is a chart of, that hopefully everyone's aware of global public debt levels on this planet. I'm sure all of our ears are still bleeding from the news and the media, who have nothing better to do than to talk about this issue and the debate over and over and over again. Of course, the U.S. government's reached its debt ceiling, an arbitrary limit that basically has been doubled about 4 times since 1981, from $1 trillion to $14.3 trillion. And while the media and the U.S. Congress will continue to pretend that there are grounds for debate and the specter of debate and all of this stuff we hear in the news, there is absolutely no other option for them to raise this debt ceiling again if the U.S. plans to postpone its huge and massive sovereign debt default, which is also completely and utterly inevitable. But before I go into that, a quick parable. Let's imagine a remote island with 100 human inhabitants. A little hypothetical society decides to use a currency system to engage labor and to organize their resources. So they collect little shells and number them. They figure we're going to get 1,000 shells in circulation, and each person will be given 10 shells, and they start to exchange. At some point, one of the inhabitants, for whatever reason, finds his or herself in the position where they don't have enough shells to meet their needs. So they think for a second and they say, okay, I have my friend, maybe I can borrow some shells. So they decide to ask a friend if they can borrow 4 of their shells. And the friend agrees, but only on the condition that those 4 shells will be paid back with 2 shells added as a service fee. So they agree, and suddenly this pattern takes hold, and everyone on the island kind of begins to trade these shells as a commodity. They start to loan shells to each other for whatever purposes are necessary whenever there's a deficiency for whatever reason, in exchange, of course, for the extra shells on top. And then something really strange happens when they start to do this. Many of the inhabitants find themselves in debt to others for extended amounts, very frequently and at increasing rates. Eventually, most everyone seems to be in debt to everyone else. Something is very strange in their mind. They can't quite figure out what's going on. So the little society gets together at a meeting, and they start to calculate what everyone owes to everyone else. And they find that for every 4 shells loaned, a fee of 2 shells was added, of course. And then they figured that the entire money supply had been cycled in one iteration, which meant 1,000 shells loaned 4 at a time. It produced 250 transactions. 2 shells charged per transaction, so therefore 500 shells are needed to settle the debt responsibility of the total society. But they scratch their heads because there's only 1,000 shells in circulation, so where are the other 500 shells going to come from? And then they naturally think for a moment, and in an embarrassed fashion, they cancel all of their debts universally. They laugh at themselves and wonder how they could ever have been so foolish to begin with. And this brings us back to this absurd spectacle of ignorance and insanity that I don't really know what to say after the more I think about it. But the global debt crisis is fundamentally the result of the fact that our money is created out of debt, and it's brought into existence through loans. We charge interest on it, on those loans. And regardless of what you hear any government official, media on this planet claim as to the solution of this supposed debt crisis, which is almost universally related to cutting budgets and social programs or endless IMF refinancing, imposing austerity, of course, which I'll talk about in a moment, nothing can or will stop this cancerous debt growth without outright global debt cancellation. Again, nothing. And if there's anything you walk away from this meeting with, I hope that is one thing. Basically, the rules of this system have to be transcended in order for it to save itself, which is very interesting because obviously it shows that the system is intrinsically flawed. And frankly, I don't know which aspect is worse, the fact that, the utter insanity of this, the problem even materializes, and the causality associated, or the fact that the public at large has absolutely no clear view of this. They have no understanding of what this actually means, or the mathematical reality of what we've been doing for the past century. This practice of creating money out of debt and loaning it to the public and government in exchange for fees that do not exist, it should be the absolute focal point of debate in every government, every single blatantly orange country you see here. So the problem is structural, is my point. And since the very nature of being in debt creates limitations for individuals, corporations, and governments, the detriment of this reality is vast, because it opens the door for all sorts of other problems that relate to what we would define as societal collapse. And these problems that are beginning to emerge on the horizon are simply not necessary. And this is important that people begin to understand it when they begin to hear and begin to witness, in fact, over the course of the next few years, what is unfolding. It's not even remotely necessary. Now, before I go any further, though, I'm going to switch here to a different view of the monetary system that, again, isn't recognized whatsoever. We need to consider this very importantly, and this is basically the foundation of how we arrive at the new economic model that I will briefly talk about at the end of this presentation. We have two parallel opposing forces at work in the modern market system that we use. The first force could be called the money sequence of value, and I apologize for the terminology, but it really is the best frame of reference if you get used to this language. I borrow this term from a man named John McMurtry, who wrote a great book called The Cancer Stage of Capitalism, by the way. The money sequence of value refers to the governing principles of intent regarding monetary valuation and exchange. As we know, money is a medium of exchange, as it's traditionally called, but in order for money to exist as such a medium, it has to have value in and of itself. Therefore, it has to exist as a commodity in and of itself, and there's no way around that. The easiest way to understand the money sequence of value is to reflect on the obvious interest that we all have in acquiring money and maximizing profits or income, and hence saving money and reducing our expenses, hence creating what they call cost efficiency in traditional economics. Our lives today, all of us, one way or another, revolves around the management and movement of money, needless to say. And because of this, there is an empirical disconnect between the intents associated with the physical world we inhabit, intents meaning the foundational life ground of what actually supports us, along with the natural laws that we have to succumb to, and the intents generated by our monetary reality. They are completely opposing forces. To put it into a related terminology, the money sequence of value is completely decoupled from the natural life sequence of value. The life sequence values ecological balance, good public health, and other qualities of empirical human sustainability and prosperity, while the money sequence values cost-cutting and profit maximization with the assumption that this somehow magically creates and supports the life sequence. It's a historical illusion. The assumption the assumption is that, it actually reminds me of a good George Carlin joke. He's like, sometimes Adam Smith's invisible hand gives you the middle finger. That's a cute comment. The assumption is that the money sequence will give way to the life sequence, and this is completely statistically void. There's not one economic treatment I've ever seen. I've read the gamut of university documents on economics up to the doctoral level, and you won't find a statistical evaluation of this. It doesn't exist. And it's basically a religious rationale in Adam Smith's invisible hand, like this God, this invisible entity that somehow magically, if we're all out for our own self-interest and engaging the money sequence only, that it will manifest into the life sequence and everyone will be happy and balanced in prosperity and people are taken care of as a civilization. That just simply isn't true. Back then, though, historically, it's worth pointing out because people often ask, well, what happened in our society? In the simplistic point where Adam Smith and these early capitalist notions came forward, it could be accepted in abstraction because life was much more simplistic in its use. The labor and the system of labor and the simplicity of exchange was such that you really couldn't see the inherent inefficiency built in. But as time has gone on, the true nature of the money sequence has really shown its true colors. And today I would say most everything is officially backwards with respect to proper intent as far as survival. For example, corporations are now being rewarded for producing inferior products, creating waste, reducing efficiency overall, just to keep the material economy and the labor system going. In fact, the very notion of what an economy is supposed to be has been redefined to its opposite. No relationship to the physical world whatsoever. It's a human behavioral abstraction theory. In fact, the more problems and inefficiency in society today, the better the monetary economy. The more problems we have, the better the economy will be. And this, again, is what makes this debt picture so tragically bizarre, because it's an elaborate fiction, a fictional ledger born out of this money sequence I just spoke of. And the fact that we accept this as the basis of our practice empirically, and what people will debate to the end of time on its apparent value, to me represents a mass structural delusion. It's a big, gigantic, well, they hate to use the Zeitgeist pun, but there's a massive problem in the way people are referencing reality at this stage. It's dysfunctional. We're basically ready to shut down our entire society for reasons that don't exist. Completely fictional creations imposing austerity to an extent that it could really affect billions and billions of people in massive ways, only because we acknowledge this rule set that we've concocted as being empirical. The United States alone has about $57 trillion of public and private debt in and of itself. That's both public and private, meaning your personal debt versus the government. And that equates to almost $200,000 per person in liability. And that debt will only grow because it has to grow. Just like our island parable, the entire world is in debt to itself, and the result is nothing but, well, complete insanity. In fact, I would say the best way to describe this is as a social cancer and a very legitimate concept. If you look at society as a singular entity, as the group mind that it is in its evolution, our brains haven't changed that much in tens of thousands of years. Our intelligence is a product of cultural conditioning and education through a serial development through time. And on that same scope, we have this cancerous notion and belief system that is basically taking us over, and we don't see it, just like any immune system doesn't see it. It continues to spread and grow, and it will just simply strangle us like a tumor with its limiting effects. Now, I'm not going to expand this point to the many other inherent flaws in this system due to time, because I could talk at length. But if anyone here wants a treatment on this, there's a lecture called Social Pathology, which was done in 2010, which is almost 3 hours long, which deals explicitly with the various manifestations that have arisen out of this false system of association we've generated for managing our society. Now, people always say, what about reform? And this is something that's always in debate. And those in the political spectrum that are aware of problems associated with debt or the Federal Reserve, they always talk about reform. Can we change the system so it directly relates to this life sequence? Is it possible? And I'm sorry to say the answer in all logical considerations is a definitive no. If money is a commodity in and of itself, holding value, there's no way the money sequence can inherently respect the life sequence. It can only exist on a contrary plane. It is simply based entirely on the opposite set of assumptions and values required to create social and environmental balance. Can it be improved? Yes, it can, but we have to remember that patchwork legislation, which is the only thing that really keeps any sanity within this system, legislation and laws are patches. They're responses to failures of a particular structural organization. And it's very important people realize that. So we can create legislation over and over again to continue to fight the inherent intents of this system, or we can bite the bullet and go at the root cause and get rid of it. And this brings us to austerity and consequences, building on the debt problem. Since most simply don't see the real problem here, all talk revolves around measures to limit borrowing and spending. This again limits our possibility and flexibility, since money is the initiator of everything. Who suffers from austerity also, historically speaking? It's always those that are most vulnerable to its causal source, which is the middle and lower classes. These are the ones that will always be hit the hardest through the limitations imposed, usually